It wasn't an alarm that jolted me awake at 7 in the morning. It was the sound of steel smashing into glass. I sat up looking out the window of the small caretaker's cottage I'd called home for a decade. A massive yellow excavator was tearing through the roof of the Victorian greenhouse. My greenhouse, the sanctuary where I'd nursed my grandmother until her final day. My phone buzzed, a text from my brother Julian. It read, "Developers are here early. You have 30 minutes to clear your junk." We sold the dirt. I didn't scream. I didn't run outside to stop them. I just watched 10 years of my life turn into debris. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my leather satchel and stepped out into the dust. The air tasted like diesel fumes and pulverized brick. Standing near the edge of the property line were my 3 siblings dressed as if they were attending a garden party rather than a demolition. Julian was checking his watch, looking bored. Tyler was filming the destruction on his phone, probably for a story caption about new beginnings. And Chloe was inspecting her manicure, actively ignoring the fact that the excavator bucket was currently crushing the vintage rose bushes she used to claim she loved. When they saw me, the energy shifted instantly. They straightened up. This was the moment they had been waiting for. They didn't just want the land, they wanted the show. They wanted the satisfaction of seeing the poor, sentimental black sheep sister fall to her knees and beg for the history to be saved. They wanted my grief to validate their power. "Look at it this way, Maya." Julian shouted over the roar of the engine, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "We're doing you a favor, we're clearing out the weeds. This place is going to be worth 10 times as much once we scrape it clean." Tyler laughed, lowering his phone to aim it at my face. "Yeah, think of it as aggressive landscaping. You should thank us. We're finally making this dump profitable." My chest tightened, a reflex of pure hot anger. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that those weeds were rare hybrids Grandma spent 40 years cultivating. I wanted to tell them they were desecrating the only thing that actually mattered to the woman who gave them their trust funds. But I stopped myself. Grandma Elena had taught me a lot of things, but the most important lesson wasn't about botany. It was about psychology. She called it strategic stoicism. The modern term was the grey rock method. When you are dealing with people who feed on drama, who consume your emotions like fuel, the only way to win is to become as uninteresting as a rock. If I screamed, I gave them a story. If I cried, I gave them a victory. So I gave them nothing. I didn't frown. I didn't shout. I simply walked past them toward the caretaker's cottage door, unlocked it and went inside for the last time. I didn't pack clothes or furniture. I went straight to the loose floorboard under the bed. I lifted it and took out a heavy velvet-wrapped bundle. Inside was an old brass surveyor's compass and a single heavy key made of oxidized titanium. I put them in my bag and walked back out. Julian stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the driveway. "What? No speech? No crying about how heartless we are? Come on, Maya, don't be boring." I looked at him. I didn't focus on his eyes. I focused on the bridge of his nose, offering him a blank, unfocused stare. I checked my watch, then looked back at the horizon. I acted as if he were a minor inconvenience, like a drizzle of rain. "Excuse me," I said, my voice flat and monotone. "I have an appointment." I stepped around him and kept walking. I could feel his confusion radiating off him. He was ready for a fight, and I had handed him a vacuum. Silence is the loudest noise you can make to someone who craves attention. I got into my 10-year-old sedan and started the engine. As I reversed down the driveway, I saw them standing there looking annoyed and unsatisfied, like children whose toy had broken. I waited until I turned the corner and the estate was out of sight before I reached for my phone. I didn't call a friend to vent. Mr. Sterling picked up on the first ring. I kept my eyes on the road, my voice steady, cold and precise. "They broke ground," I said. "Initiate the protocol." As I drove away from the cloud that used to be my home, the silence in the car felt heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with 10 years of memories that explained exactly why we were here. To the outside world, and certainly to my siblings, the narrative was simple. They were the successes, the entrepreneurs, the influencers, the movers and shakers. I was the failure. The unmarried artist who stayed home to nurse a dying woman because she couldn't make it in the real world. They saw my devotion as weakness. Grandma Elena saw it as the ultimate interview. For the last decade, family holidays were nothing more than quarterly earnings calls for Julian, Tyler and Chloe. They would roll up in leased sports cars, spend 45 minutes eating turkey, and 3 hours asking subtle questions about the estate planning. They hovered around Grandma like vultures circling a wounded animal, waiting for her to stop moving so they could start feeding. I was there for everything else. I was there for the chemo appointments. I was there for the late nights when the pain medication wore off and she needed someone to hold her hand. But mostly I was there for the work. While they were busy building their personal brands, I was in the study digitizing 50 years of business records. I was learning the difference between a trust and a foundation. I was memorizing the soil composition of the land they just sold. One afternoon, about a month before she passed, Grandma and I were sitting in that greenhouse, the one currently being crushed by an excavator. She pointed to an ancient oak tree outside. She told me that my siblings suffered from something dangerous. She called it high time preference. She said they were people who would chop down an apple tree just to get the fruit 5 minutes faster. They couldn't conceive of a future further away than their next credit card statement. They consumed value. They didn't create it. She looked at me, her eyes sharp despite the morphine. You, my dear, have low time preference. You are willing to be bored. You are willing to suffer today so you can build something that stands for a century. They want the harvest, Maya, but you are the only one who bothered to water the roots. I didn't understand the full weight of her words. Then I thought she was just comforting me, trying to make me feel better about being the stay-at-home granddaughter. But now, as I merged onto the highway, leaving the destruction behind me, I realized it hadn't been a metaphor. It was a warning. She knew they would destroy the house. She knew they would sell the land for quick cash. She knew they couldn't help themselves because greed makes you short-sighted. That's why she didn't leave them the empire. You don't give a torch to someone who is just going to burn the house down to stay warm for a night. You give them a pile of cash to distract them, and you give the keys to the one person who knows how to keep the fire contained. They thought I was the servant. In reality, I was the apprentice. And the apprenticeship was finally over. My mind drifted back to 2 weeks ago, to the moment the trap was actually set. It was in the boardroom of Sterling and Associates, a room that smelled of old leather and expensive billable hours. The mahogany table was long enough to land a plane on, and sitting at the far end were Julian, Tyler, and K.H. Lowe. They were vibrating with anxiety. They knew Grandma was wealthy, but they didn't know the number. They were terrified she had donated it all to a cat sanctuary. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of professional indifference. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. He didn't waste time on sentimental preambles. He went straight to the numbers. To my grandsons, Julian and Tyler, and my granddaughter Chloe, I leave the sum of $3.6 million each to be transferred immediately upon the signing of the attached release waivers. The air left the room, replaced instantly by the sound of 3 people exhaling a lifetime of financial irresponsibility. 3.6 million, it was enough to pay off their debts, buy a penthouse and lease a lifestyle they hadn't earned for another decade. They didn't look sad that their grandmother was dead. They looked relieved that their credit cards would work again. Then Sterling turned to me. And to my granddaughter Maya Vance, I leave the contents of safety deposit box 772 at the Ironwood Reserve and my grandfather's brass surveyor's compass. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was confused. That's it? Tyler asked, leaning forward. A box and a what? A compass? A surveyor Uncas compass, Sterling corrected gently. Tyler let out a sharp, barking laugh. He looked at me, his eyes shining with cruel amusement. Wow, Maya, Grandma finally cut the check for all those years of nursing. Looks like she valued your services at exactly 0. Chloe was already typing on her phone, snapping a photo of the check Mr. Sterling had slid across the table to her. She didn't even look up as she spoke. Maybe the compass is a metaphor, sweetie. You know, to help you find a real job now that the free ride is over. Self-made. Julian the ringleader didn't laugh, he was already calculating. He looked at Mr. Sterling. The cash is good, but what about the estate, the house, the land? It falls into the residuary estate, Sterling said, which per the terms you are about to sign you are agreeing to liquidate. Julian nodded, pulling a Mont Blanc pen from his pocket. Good, liquidate it all. The house is a money pit. We LL sell the dirt to that developer who's been sniffing around. We can probably get another 2 million each if we flatten the place quickly. My stomach turned, but my face remained stone. They weren't just taking the money, they were actively planning to erase the history. They viewed the estate, the place where our father grew up, where Grandma built her life, as nothing more than a distressed asset to be converted into cash. Sign here, Sterling said, sliding the heavy waivers toward them. They signed with eager, greedy flourishes. In less than 2 minutes they had legally agreed that $3.6 million was the entirety of their claim. They were so blinded by the number on the check that they didn't bother to ask what was in the residuary estate. They didn't ask what was in box 772. They took the bait. They ate the fruit and didn't notice they had just signed over the orchard. I sat there, the heavy brass compass sitting in my lap, cold against my skin. I didn't say a word. I let them high-five. I let them plan their vacations. I let them believe they Had won because in business, as Grandma taught me, you never interrupt your competition when they are making a mistake. I drove past the city limits heading toward the mountains. My destination wasn't a bank on Main Street with free lollipops and a drive-through. It was the Ironwood Reserve. To the uninitiated, it looked like a data center or a high-end research facility, a brutalist cube of concrete and black glass nestled in the pines. There was no signage. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't find it, and if you found it, you certainly couldn't get in. I rolled down my window at the security gate. I didn't give a name. I simply held up the heavy oxidized titanium key. The guard scanned it with a laser device, nodded once, and the heavy steel gate slid open silently. This was the difference between being rich and being powerful. My siblings were currently posting photos of their new Porsches, desperate for the world to see their wealth. This place existed to ensure no one ever saw yours. Mr. Sterling was waiting for me in a private viewing room deep underground. The air here was recycled, cool, and smelled faintly of ozone. He stood when I entered, but he didn't offer condolences. He offered a file folder. "The waivers are filed," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the small steel room. "The transfers to Julian, Tyler, and K.H. Lowe were completed at 9:00 a.m. this morning. They have their $3.6 million. They are effectively bought out." "Did they ask any questions?" I asked, sitting down at the metal table. "Only one," Sterling replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Julian asked if I could expedite the sale of the estate so they could start construction sooner. He called the property distressed inventory." "He was right," I said. "It was distressed because he was on it." Sterling slid a black box toward me. It was marked only with the number 772. "Your grandmother was a student of history," Maya Sterling said softly. "She knew that empires aren't destroyed by invading armies. They are destroyed by entitled heirs." The money she gave them wasn't an inheritance, it was a severance package. She calculated that $10.8 million was exactly 15% of her liquid assets, the cost of doing business to protect the core. I inserted the titanium key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying thunk. I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. There were no diamonds. There was something far more valuable. There was paper. I pulled out the leather-bound dossier on top. The title read, "Vance Sovereign Holdings." I began to flip through the pages, my breath catching in my throat. I knew Grandma had investments, but I had assumed they were stocks, bonds, maybe some mutual funds. I was wrong. First, there were the patent portfolios. I ran my finger down the list. Industrial cooling systems, logistics algorithms. The underlying tech for the shipping software Julian's startup used. He was paying licensing fees to a company he thought was a faceless conglomerate. He was paying me. Then beneath the patents was the deed to the land trust. I read the legal description. All surface and subsurface rights to the parcel known as the Vance estate. "Wait," I said, looking up at Sterling. "The siblings sold the house to the developers. They sold the structure," Sterling corrected. "They sold the wood, the brick, and the glass, but the land, the dirt itself that has been held in this trust since 1982. They didn't sell the land, Maya. They sold a ground lease." He handed me a pen. "The moment they demolished that greenhouse, they triggered a violation. Clause in the lease agreement," Sterling said. "As the new trustee of Vance Sovereign Holdings, you have the right to renegotiate the terms or evict the tenants." I looked at the document, I looked at the pen. I wasn't the poor artist's sister anymore. I wasn't the nurse, I was the landlord. I uncapped the pen and signed my name on the bottom line. The ink was black and permanent. "Let them build," I said, handing the file back. "Let them spend every dime of their $3 million building their shiny new condos, and when they're done, we'll send the invoice." It took exactly 180 days for the cracks to show. In the 6 months since the will reading, my siblings had treated money not as a resource but as an accelerant. They didn't just spend it, they set it on fire. Julian leased a penthouse office for his development firm that cost $20,000 a month. Chloe hired a branding agency to design a logo for the condos before the foundation was even poured. Tyler bought 2 sports cars because he claimed they were tax write-offs for client acquisition. They were playing business. And like all amateurs, they confused revenue with profit and liquidity with wealth. By the time construction on the condos actually hit the halfway mark, they had a problem. The custom Italian marble they ordered was over budget. The unions were charging overtime, and their personal bank accounts, once fat with Grandma's $3.6 million, were starting to run dangerously low. They were asset-rich in a half-built building, but cash poor in reality. They needed a bridge loan, or better yet, an investment vehicle to park their remaining capital to generate yield. While they waited for the condos to sell, Julian Ever the shark found the solution. He called a family meeting to announce he had secured an invitation to an exclusive invite-only hedge fund called Athelgard Capital. It's a black box fund, he told them, his voice thick with unearned confidence. Wall elite only. They usually require a $50 million buy-in, but I pulled some strings. If we pull our remaining cash, everything we have left, we can get in at the ground floor. The projected returns are 20% quarterly. It's free money. They were desperate, they were greedy. And above all, they were arrogant enough to believe they belonged in that room. So they scraped the bottom of the barrel, they liquidated their personal portfolios. They pulled cash from their savings. They gathered every last loose dollar from the initial inheritance totaling $4.2 million. They signed the subscription agreement. Digitally, they wired the funds at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. At 2001, a notification pinged on the third monitor in my office. New capital injection approved. I took a sip of my coffee and opened the dossier on my screen. The logo at the top read Agard Capital. Beneath it, in the fine print of the general partner disclosure, was a single name, Vance Sovereign Holdings. My siblings hadn't invested with Wall Street. This is the power of what economists call asymmetric information. It is the imbalance of power that occurs when one party holds critical data that the other party lacks. In a fair market, buyers and sellers know the same truths. In a war, you ensure your enemy is making decisions based on a map that you drew. They believed Athlard was their lifeboat. In reality, it was a lobster trap. I scrolled down to the terms they had just signed without reading. Clause 14, lock-up period. Their capital was now frozen for a minimum of 3 years. They couldn't withdraw a penny without a 60% penalty. Clause 18, management fees. I was now legally entitled to charge them a 2% management fee and 20% of any profits. I was managing their money. I was controlling their liquidity. And they were going to pay me for the privilege of holding their inheritance hostage. I clicked accept on the wire transfer. The $4.2 million hit my corporate account instantly. I leaned back in my chair. They were now fully leveraged, completely exposed, and entirely dependent on a fund manager they had never met. Julian sent a text to the family group chat. Fund secured. We're in the big leagues now. I didn't reply. I just forwarded the confirmation email to Mr. Sterling with a simple note. The fish are in the net. The grand opening of the Vance luxury residences was exactly what I expected, loud, expensive, and desperate. A banner hung over the entrance reading Vance Legacy, which was ironic considering the building stood on the grave of the actual legacy they had bulldozed. I parked my sedan between a Lamborghini and a McLaren. I checked my reflection in the rear view mirror. I wasn't wearing my usual gardening clothes or the sensible knits I wore to the nursing home. I was wearing a black vintage suit from the 1950s grandma's favourite and the string of South Sea pearls she had hidden in the ranch house. I didn't look like the poor relation anymore. I looked like the person who signed the checks. I walked past the velvet rope. The bouncer moved to stop me, but I didn't even slow down. I simply projected the kind of absolute authority that makes men in cheap suits instinctively step aside. I found Julian in the centre of the lobby holding a magnum of champagne. He was holding court laughing with a group of potential buyers. When he saw me, his smile faltered, then hardened into a sneer. He handed his glass to K.H. Lowe and marched over. "You have some nerve," he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid making a scene. "The guest list is full, Maya. We don't have space for handouts tonight." "I'm not here for a handout, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient house music, "and I'm not here for the party." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single cream-coloured envelope. I pressed it into his chest. "I'm here for the rent." He frowned, looking at the envelope like it was a bomb. "What are you talking about? We own this building, we own the land, we sold it to the development corps." "No," I corrected calmly. "You sold the structure, you sold the improvements. But you didn't check the title search, did you? The land itself, the dirt, the bedrock, the very ground you are standing on is held by a separate entity, a land trust." He ripped the envelope open. His eyes scanned the document. I watched the blood drain from his face as he read the header. "Ground lease invoice payable to Vance Sovereign Holdings. You're trespassing," I explained as if teaching a slow child. "Grandma split the asset. You got the house, I got the earth. And normally the ground rent is nominal, $1 a year." I took a step closer. "But you didn't read the covenant, Julian. Clause 4. Section B, destruction of historical botanical assets triggers an immediate rate adjustment." I pointed to the spot where the greenhouse used to be, now a concrete parking pad. "You crushed the greenhouse to build a parking lot. That violation triggered a penalty rate." Julian was shaking. You can't do this." "I already did." I said, "The new ground rent is set at 80% of the building's gross revenue, payable monthly." I looked at KH Lowe and Tyler, who had wandered over, confused and terrified by the look on their brothers' face. You built a $20 million building on my land. I told them, you can keep the building, but from this moment forward 80 cents of every dollar you make goes to me. You aren't developers, you're my property managers, and if you miss a payment I seize the structure. I plucked the champagne glass from Julian's trembling hand. Congratulations on the opening, I said. Get back to work, rent is due on the 1st. I walked out of the lobby while they were still staring at the invoice. The sound of their panic faded as the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind me. I didn't look back. There is no point in checking the rearview mirror when you own the road ahead. I drove straight to the ferry terminal. The rusty compass and the titanium key had one final destination, the private island sanctuary 20 m off the coast. This was the crown jewel of the estate, the one piece of land my siblings didn't even know existed because it wasn't on social media. As the ferry cut through the dark water, I pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts list. I found Julian, Tyler and Chloe. I didn't delete them, that would be emotional. That would imply I cared enough to be hurt. Instead, I tapped edit. I moved them out of the family group and dropped them into a new folder I labeled tenants. They were assets now, distressed assets, high-maintenance assets, but assets nonetheless. I arrived at the island house an hour later. My studio was waiting, the north-facing windows looking out over a restless, infinite ocean. For the first time in 10 years, the silence wasn't heavy. It didn't smell like sickness or old medicine. It smelled like salt air and ink. Grandma was right. The loudest people in the room are usually the most afraid. I chose to be quiet. Grandma taught me that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. If you're building your own empire in the quiet, share this story and tell me in the comments, would you have evicted them or made them pay rent for? If you enjoyed the story, hit like and subscribe for more story. You are not alone. God bless you. Thanks for watching.